If I were to ask you who were some of the most ruthless leaders in all of human history, you'd probably say kings, warlords, dictators, and you wouldn't be wrong. But corporations and business executives have perpetrated some of the worst offenses against mankind, which I think is almost worse than like warlords or dictators. Because with warlords or dictators, that's like part of their whole job, like being like offensive, like deadly rulers, warlords and dictators. But business executives are just sitting in an office somewhere and looking at numbers and choosing profits over people, which is pretty disgusting. Today, a corporation generally has quite a few departments: finance, human resources, marketing, sales, and so on. But throughout history, some of the most powerful corporations have added one more division to their team, a full-blown army. Here's a fun fact. Pepsi once acquired 17 submarines, a frigate, a destroyer, a cruiser, and a couple oil tankers from the Soviet Union in 1989, technically making Pepsi the 6th largest naval power in the world. Weird, right? But Pepsi was just accepting payment from a valued customer. Their new navy wasn't functional though, and instead was just run-down military crafts from a bygone era. But they were still quite valuable at the scrapyard, which is exactly where they went. After acquiring their rusty fleet, Pepsi immediately sold them for scrap and sent the USSR some soda. And by some, I mean $3 billion worth. Pepsi may have acquired some heavy artillery, but it's not like they were trying to nuke Coca-Cola or anything else like that. They just wanted to crush them in some good, old-fashioned, capitalist corporate competition, and the Soviet population looked like a prime new market. The attempt to break into the Soviet market began in the late 1950s, when Donald Kendall, the head of Pepsi International, handed Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev a glass of Pepsi at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. Khrushchev loved it, and then Vice President Richard Nixon saw an opening to use Pepsi to soften relations between these two great adversaries. On multiple occasions, Pepsi facilitated deals with the Soviet Union, even trading Pepsi for Stolichnaya vodka at one point. It was as if Pepsi had engaged in some type of diplomacy, extending American cultural influence and gaining a foothold in the USSR for American companies. But Pepsi's actions were tame compared to the extensive history of companies taking on government capabilities. We typically celebrate businesses that make great products, companies that are always trying to build a better mousetrap. With clever ads and useful ideas, they can beat their competition. But some CEOs took their desire for corporate domination a step further: global domination, controlling whole industries, trade routes, and even swaths of territory, acting as a pseudo-government. On today's episode of Weird World, we're exploring the history of real corporate conquests. From diamonds to bananas, there are many examples of products that spurred actual corporate empires. Next, we'll see how some businesses became pseudo-governments, cornering the market by force and administering their will across entire regions of the globe. The British East India Company was in the business of trading valuable goods, like spices, tea, cotton, and even opium. But producing and transporting those goods required some serious muscle. So much so that the end result was a corporation that acted much more like an imperial power. For the British East India Company, business risks included violent rebellions and losing inventory due to pirate attacks in the Indian Ocean. To keep the supply chains running, they needed a navy. So the East India Company was granted a royal charter to build an army in the mid-1700s. Britain's initial idea was to simply help the British East India Company protect its warehouses, ships, and fortified ports. In this situation, profit was king. The safer the journey, the greater return on investment for their shareholders. And build an army they did. A typical ship would be armed with more than 30 cannons, rivaling the most powerful European warships of that era. With so much firepower, the corporation grew to a point where it began to terrify and intimidate its parent company, the British government. At its peak, the company's army included 280,000 men, which was larger than the British military in the 1830s and 40s. And that's just their humans. The British East India Company also recruited cavalry, which included Indian mercenaries who fought to secure British control of the region. They even acquired a cadre of elephants. The British noticed that some Indian rulers used elephants in battle. The British chose not to fight battles on elephant back, but they did use elephants to move massive amounts of supplies and equipment. So elephants were native wildlife that quickly became crucial to the company's logistics. Despite their stranglehold on the Indian subcontinent, they still relied on local knowledge and resources to stay on top. Many animals throughout history have been drafted into military conflicts. Before radio, pigeons were one of the fastest ways to communicate crucial information. They were easily trained and could even be fitted with photography equipment to perform reconnaissance operations on enemy positions. The UK was said to have used over 250,000 homing pigeons in World War II, a size comparable to the number of East India Company soldiers in the early 1800s. Meanwhile, the US began training bats to release bombs over Japan. These cute little guys never actually saw combat, as the war ended before they could be used. But the US was fully prepared to equip them with explosive attached to mini parachutes during World War II. The US Navy also trained dolphins to locate mines and even detect enemy swimmers. They continued to train upwards of 75 dolphins at a program based in San Diego. We'll have to wait and see if they ever come in handy. Given the threat of pirate sneak attacks, the British East India Company may well have wanted military-grade spy dolphins as well. It's safe to say if they could have, they would have, as they had no problem exploiting horses, elephants, people, and anything else they could. Pound for pound, this corporation was one of the most powerful entities to ever exist on the planet. It built something much bigger than a profitable business. It was an empire, ruling India for over a century. This company's dominance brought about a bizarre situation. When India sought to gain independence, it was fighting for freedom from a corporation. Shockingly, this wasn't the only time British business leaders engaged in colonialization. Enter De Beers, a diamond mining company co-founded by Cecil Rhodes in the late 1800s. For Rhodes, the name of the game was to keep diamond prices high. Diamonds have a reputation for being unique, rare, and hard to come by. But that image is a carefully curated illusion owed to a little clever marketing and a lot of artificial scarcity. In fact, given what we know about the science of their formation, diamonds may very well be the most abundant gem on Earth. But Rhodes knew if he could control the supply of the global diamond market and oversee their release into the global supply chain, he could create the illusion of scarcity and charge whatever he wanted for diamonds. Rhodes consolidated a ton of African diamond mines under one giant monopoly and also made deals with government-run mines. Eventually, he controlled 80% of the world's supply of diamonds. Rhodes was motivated by a vision for colonial control. It said he sought to paint the map red, bringing more and more territory under the British flag. He even dreamed of reclaiming the American colonies. Rhodes was simultaneously the world's preeminent diamond mogul and the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in South Africa. His business plans and his ambition for imperial expansion were intimately tied together. Rhodes began to see the nearby provinces as adversaries. For example, Paul Kruger, the president of Transvaal, was making it difficult to mine diamonds by heavily taxing train traffic that passed through his country. Plus, Kruger controlled the supply of dynamite, which was integral to Rhodes' mining operations. Rhodes became determined to overthrow Kruger. The plan was to use a private military owned by the British South African Company. They weren't super creative about naming their businesses back then, which was led by Leander Starr Jameson, to invade Transvaal in the final days of 1895. At the same time, Rhodes and Jameson hoped to spur on a rebellion of the British and German residents of Johannesburg, the largest city in Transvaal, causing chaos and political unrest. But the would-be rebels couldn't get their act together, and the plan fell apart. Kruger found out about the plan and, using his own troops, ambushed Jameson's army, which surrendered. The scheme was a violent attempt to remake the government of Transvaal into something more compatible with Rhodes' vision. However, as Rhodes learned, rebellions are not so easy to pull off. The so-called Jameson Raid was a failure. The history of violence in the diamond industry is harrowing. The desire for diamonds has meant a heavy human price to pay. However, plenty of other companies have engaged in similar behavior, and you've probably eaten something from at least one of them. I'm talking about bananas. Yeah, as weird as it sounds, many lives have been lost in the quest to supply the world with bananas for under $1 a pound. Everyone knows bananas are pretty cheap, unless you're Lucille Bluth.
I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
A single banana costs mere pocket change, and bananas are a great product. They go great with peanut butter and they're very portable. But when your product is practically free, you don't really have to worry about dwindling demand. This situation is totally contrived. United Fruit achieved low banana prices by controlling the supply of bananas and absorbing nearly every aspect of banana production in Central America, and it gained such immense influence that they became the de facto governments of Honduras and Guatemala. Just like the British East India Company, they've faced a similar problem: rebellions. I don't know if you've noticed this, but people generally don't like being ruled with an iron fist by a corporation. And the situation was no different in Central and South America at the start of the 20th century. As they grew, United Fruit began taking over government functions. This corrupt system is where we get the term Banana Republic from. United Fruit had its tentacles all over Central and South America, earning it the nickname El Pulpo, or the octopus, in local newspapers. The company notably used its influence to put down striking laborers by force. Instead of raising an army like the British East India Company, United Fruit pulled strings to get the Colombian federal troops to defend their business interests. United Fruit workers would periodically demand better working conditions, engaging in protests and even attempting to sabotage the National Railway. On December 5, 1928, around 1,400 workers and their families assembled in the city of Ciénaga. Around 300 soldiers were present in the town square, and late in the night they opened fire on the workers, in what became known as the Banana Massacre. And it didn't stop there. The military planned to assassinate the remaining Union leaders as well. It's unclear who made the final decision that led to the killings, but evidence shows that United Fruit representatives were in communication with the US State Department at the time. United Fruit had become so powerful that it could direct political pressure and harness government power to subjugate its own workers. And this wasn't a one-time thing either. A mix of US and corporate interests have motivated several instances of regime change and bloodshed in Latin America. Decades after the Banana Massacre, the US kicked out the leader of Guatemala in 1954, who wanted to see United Fruit nationalized. In 1973, the US was part of the effort to unseat socialist leader Salvador Allende in Chile and install dictator Augusto Pinochet, who had the support from major corporations like weapons and technology manufacturer ITT Incorporated. In the 1980s, Reagan financially backed paramilitary forces in Nicaragua in an attempt to overthrow the left-wing Sandinista government, in what we now know as the Iran-Contra scandal. And then of course there's Panama. The US orchestrated Panama's independence from Colombia in 1903 in order to control the Panama Canal. The US would later meddle in Panama's affairs again, ousting its military dictator in 1989. These interventions were often motivated by profit. The US wanted open markets and favorable conditions for its businesses operating in the region. As much as we may not like it or know about it, terrible violence is seen as a corporate strategy in Latin America. United Fruit eventually rebranded as Chiquita Banana, but don't let that fresh new look fool you. Chiquita was held liable for multiple deaths between 1997 and 2004. Killings which were perpetrated by a paramilitary group called the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. In court, Chiquita claimed it acted as a reasonable business person, and said the terrorist group basically forced them to pay up. But the company has had a long history of using violence to maintain order and its industry dominance. The story of banana republics is a stark reminder that things that happened 100 years ago are still affecting us today. Throughout history, some corporations have become weirdly powerful, even rivaling countries. As we saw, some have engaged in behaviors we normally associate with nations, like quashing rebellions and perpetrating imperial wars for conquest. So the next time you see a CEO acting like a James Bond villain, remember that nefarious schemes of global domination aren't just a thing of the movies. These efforts to seize entire industries have caused massive amounts of global destabilization and societal scars, and we're still dealing with the consequences today.